Well, here we go again anyway. Okay, so young Mr. Vane, young 12-year-old Vane, is at Oakland Children's Hospital. This is where he finally actually gets more or less the details of what had happened. Somehow, now, as I said before, Mr. Vane's mom had been driving for many, many years. It was not her first time driving that RV. It was not her first time driving such treacherous roads. But it was the first time ever then since that's somehow she blacked out. She wasn't on any, substances or anything. Just some unknown, malevolent reason she blacked out. And then the RV went over a 30-foot cliff. And the only thing that stopped it from going further than 30 feet down were a lot of very strong, very deep-rooted trees. Mr. Vane's dad, who was an orthopedic technician, so was more than qualified to assess on the spot the best course of action to handle Mr. Vane's situation. Because, yes, typically you should not move a person who may have a serious spinal injury. However, since Mr. Vane was inside of a completely trashed RV full of fuel and other dangerous elements, Mr. Vane's dad felt the risk was necessary. And fortunately, nothing worse than already had happened. Mr. Vane's brother, he had the second most injuries, as getting a dislocated shoulder and a broken collarbone. His sister got whiplash, scratches, bruises. All of them got scratches, bruises. Parents, scratches, bruises. But yes, Mr. Vane got the worst of it. Broken back, cracked skull, fluid in the lungs, organ bruises, this, that, and the other things. After being at Oakland Children's for a couple days, Mr. Vane was finally stable enough to be transferred to David Grant Medical Center at Travis Air Force Base in California. There he would continue his recuperation. Unfortunately, he had to share a room with his brother. So, it wasn't so bad, other than the, constant examinations and checkups and IVs beeping and this, that, and the other thing, not being able to eat solid food, having to go to the bathroom in a bedpan. And of course, there was the concern about his ability to walk. Yes, his reflexes were looking positive, but it still wasn't completely determined how quickly he would be able to return to walking. There was no doubt that he would be able to, but how long it was going to take was the question. Mr. Vane's grandmother, his mother's mother, flew out from Alabama when she heard what had happened. And she flew out and came to help look after kids, help parents out, because of course now they had a lot of other things to do besides just the kids, a lot of reports and all this and that, and insurance and whatever. Of course, there was school that was going to be missed initially. And so, to Mr. Vane's dismay, a tutor was brought in for Mr. Vane and his brother. Anyway, on one particular night, one of the television networks, this is 1987, remember, so television options and entertainment options were restricted. Mr. Vane and his brother, fortunately, had the same taste in television shows as, their brothers. And their grandmother got to stay on a cot in the room with them. And on one particular night, one of the networks was playing the classic Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's the best I can get. Close enough. Anyway, Mr. Vane's bed was turned so that he could see the TV, because he was pretty much restricted to laying on his back the whole time. So they turned his bed so he could, look and see the TV. He's relatively comfortable. And Mr. Vane fell asleep, watching Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Stop doing it, she's not going to get it. Somehow in his dreams, he dreamt that outside the window of the hospital, he could see actual UFOs. Actual flying saucers, something flying outside the window of the hospital. And he wanted to get a better look. But in the real waking world, this caused his grandmother a near heart attack. Because in the real world, the real waking world, or non-waking world as Mr. Vane was, he stood up straight in bed, staring out the window, pointing towards UFOs. His grandmother, panicking and very reasonably distressed, of course, called for the nurses, who immediately came in and gently laid Mr. Vane back down in his bed. And then after that night, he had to be restrained into bed to make sure that didn't happen again. Of course, that didn't make Mr. Vane happy because I don't know if he had to stay in bed all the time. Now it was worse. He was tied into bed, but only to prevent him from standing and walking around in his sleep, which, as a child, Mr. Vane did do occasionally. Usually when he was not in his own bed. If he was in his own bed at his own house, he didn't sleepwalk. It was when he was at a unfamiliar place is when that usually happened. And being in a hospital, actually being in a few different hospitals after a few different days, it was bound to happen. Well, eventually, yes, Mr. Vane got out of the hospital. He had to wear a body cast and then a body brace for several months. But, ultimately, he recovered for the, most part. His back, to this day, still, of course, a broken back is never gonna completely heal. And he's suffered from things like scoliosis and kyphosis, curvatures of the back and indentations and all that. His broken back prevented him from being able to enlist in military service, which, kind of changes a person's future when that's what they think they might be doing when they grow up, so to speak. And of course, this injury wasn't helped in recent years when certain malevolent, idiotic, and surprisingly violent persons decided to dig their knee into his back during a brutal assault. But that's a story for another time. In hindsight, we believe that the malevolent located Mr. Vane and somehow caused the blackout, which sent the RV over the edge. Ironically enough, the next year, all of a sudden, Mr. Vane's dad was transferred to another base. The malevolent had found Mr. Vane, and now the benevolent had to hide him again. I hope you enjoyed this little story. Hope you are enlightened, and perhaps you know a little more and understand a little more about why Mr. Vane is the way he is. Because an event like that would possibly do something very traumatic up there. And we're done here. The malevolence is aching to get at us right now. Don't be a minion.